Waving in the current. It'll grow really thick, but also you can have just one or two stems coming up through other vegetation. What makes it, notable, all of the stem or all the leaves go directly off the stem, and you'll have root hairs coming out intermittently all along. So like milfoil, this one breaks off, and it doesn't even have to have a root fragment on it. If it's got a leaf and a chunk of stem, it has the potential to regrow, which if you don't want any veg on your beach, then that's not good, but it makes it really easy to start some if you don't have any and you're trying to regrow the good plants versus the bad plants. It's really
beneficial.
Was that?
Is that a beneficial plant?
Oh yeah, it's fantastic for fish habitat. All summer long, the young of the year, they're just littered in it. I had to do another part of licensing those or permitting those machines was I had to do a fish mortality study. So we had to go in and electroshock a stretch of heavy vegetation, and there were thousands, tens of thousands of the little inch or less batch perch and pumpkin seeds in 100-foot stretch of shoreline. There's so many you couldn't even come close to picking them all out. But they're just, when you hit the electroshocker, they just come up and then they flash back down as soon as you let the juice off. So yeah, crazy good habitat. What's that?
When you introduce that into a habitat, let's just say you have a clear area,
right?
And you entertain that idea. Are you basically creating an environment for noxious weeds to come into?
No, because the noxious weeds, anytime you've got open area, just like a dandelion, if you've got open grass, they're more likely for not only this, but noxious weeds to grow there as well.
Right, but when you introduce this, you're creating not necessarily a muck, but a sediment environment that would be easier for this to be drawn to, right?
Possibly. If you've got a really gravelly shoreline to begin with, then if you have a heavy vegetation that grows high in the water column, this would probably be better than most because it doesn't grow very high in the water column.
Right.
But yeah, anything that slows down the velocities in an area will create sedimentation through time. Okay. So yeah, if you want to keep your shoreline clear of vegetation, then obviously you're going to be you're not going to have anything there. But anytime you if the velocities are such that you have clean gravels now, it's not going to grow anyway, so it won't matter. In our river, you're going to get sedimentation.
I was just curious.
Yeah. It's a good question though, because that is one disadvantage of having a heavy milfoil infestation, or even a beginner milfoil infestation, is that the heavier it gets, the more it slows your water down, the more sedimentation pulls out, and the more muck you get. So a lot of the muck is dead vegetation, but quite a bit of it is sedimentation, just dissolved solids and particulate matter coming through, slows down, falls out of the water column. As soon as it gets down near the bank, velocities or near the bottom, velocities are always slower near the bottom than they are up in the water column. So it will build, but better if you're going to have plants anyways to have native plants than non-native. So that's Elodea. It's a good one. I only found one little piece of coontail out here, but now that everybody's seen it, you can see it's a brighter green color than the Elodea and almost anything else in the tub. And I'll just leave it out here on the side. It doesn't dry out very quick, and you can come by and feel it, see what the texture's like. Right next to it's a piece of buttercup. So this patch here is mostly water buttercup. It's got more of a pale stem than pale and slender stem than your Eurasian milfoil does. The roots are white roots for the most part. This is a milfoil. You can tell, boom, black roots, right? So that's milfoil, and we've got a lot more of it over in that bin. But water buttercup can grow fairly deep, but around here most of the time you see it in the first 4 to 6 foot of your shoreline. Sometimes it'll be really heavy and it'll look like a milfoil mat, but it's not. It's water buttercup. It's got one thing that's really nice is that it does grow that shallow, so that's where your wave action is. And it's actually for aquatic plants. Most aquatic plants don't have a very good root base, but water buttercup for a dainty little plant a lot of times has a pretty substantial root base. So it can help keep those fines in right along your shoreline. This, hey, I didn't even know I had this. This guy is one of our native potamogetans. I usually have just tubs of this stuff, the eelgrass type waterweed, essentially. There's lots of different varieties out there, but when folks say, you know, I got seaweed, a lot of times that's what it is. This, if you're doing a mulch, is not a good one for a mulch. It doesn't break down very easy. I was gonna talk about it when they were giving a presentation on the little harvester thing, is when we started discussing mulches. But when we did our tests on the milfoil machine, we took big loads, you know, like, I don't even remember how big our trailer is, but it's a 28-foot long trailer, 8 foot wide with bunks on it. And we'd take them out and put them in one of the employees' pastures, and the cows came through and ate it like mad to start with. They just loved it, but only lasted about 2 weeks. As soon as it got a little bit past the 1st of August, wouldn't touch it anymore. It's because it develops paraphyton, which has got a lot of silica in it. The cows didn't like the silica, so they stopped eating it entirely. But what we found was the margins of the piles that were mostly milfoil grew great. The middles of those piles burnt and wouldn't grow for 3 years because it was too hot. And the ones that were made up almost entirely of eelgrass, it just sat there for 3-4 years. It was still looking like eelgrass. So it doesn't break down very easy. So before you're making your mulch pile, know what you're putting in it. So water buttercup, elodea, knotweed. We have a lot of this. This is a native knotweed. It's more of a trip hazard than anything else, but each of these junctions can send off either roots and re-root it like a pumpkin does, vine along the way, or send out leaves and grow up from there. But it's a beneficial plant. It doesn't have any negative impacts that I know of, other than just if you get too many and you're walking along your shoreline, it'll trip you up if you're not paying attention. Let me see, I think that's about it for the natives that I've got in here. It was really difficult to collect plants this year because the water was so high. So I didn't get a lot of my long potamogetans. This plant may not be this exact one, but one that looks a lot like this will send out, each of these leaves will grow, you know, 5-6 foot long, and the main stem will grow up to 20 feet long. And then when they finally reach the top, they send out surface leaves like a lily pad. They're, you know, water resistant, and they're just a little spade-shaped plant. Looks a lot like this, just not quite as pointy. And so sometimes you gotta wait till they top out to know what they're gonna be. But they still wrap up on your boat prop, and they're kind of a nuisance. So you might have to deal with them even if they are a native veg. So this is curly-leaf pondweed. It was a fantastic year for curly-leaf. We have a couple of the turions that I set out here, little pine cone shaped things. Last year I couldn't find a single one, so that tells you how different the plant populations can be from year to year. I went to about 7 different sites looking for just one of these last year, so I could have it so people could feel it. But this year I tossed out the very first thing, came back with a load that would have filled this tray just with the tea weeder. So there's a lot of it out there this year. It's also earlier in the year, so it hasn't died back yet. This, just so you see the difference, that is milfoil. It may be a hybrid or a native. I can't remember exactly how to tell it apart, but milfoil in general, you know, looks quite a bit different depending on the maturity of the plant. So that one you can see doesn't have hardly any red in the stem at all, still got the black roots. But this one, you can see the red tinge, even though it's a pretty old plant and hasn't seen much sunlight yet, so it hasn't really put off new growth this year. But you can see the feather-shaped leaves coming off of the stem, alternating. Actually, they don't alternate. So that's one big difference between water buttercup and this, is that milfoil sends off multiple leaves at each junction along the stem. And I believe water buttercup alternates. So it's got one going off one side and then one going off another, and alternates as you go down the stem. So that is milfoil, and this is milfoil, even though it looks quite a bit different. So, but they both have the feathery shaped leaves, and they both are coming off of multiple leaves off the same bract in the stem. Not necessarily. That's it. It's really hard to differentiate, and I don't. I mean, we're not going to wipe out either, so we're not at jeopardy of making the native a sensitive species, which is the only reason why I think you would want to differentiate. The rest of this mess is a hodgepodge of water buttercup and milfoil, and you can see just by looking at the stems, a lot of times you can see that's milfoil. It's got a reddish stem. The water buttercup, white stem, and the tufts are coming out at different spots. So one side, one the other. So that's how you can tell the difference between those two. And back there is, sorry, I flicked water on you. Back there, I wasn't able to find any flowering rush because we've done an amazing job of controlling it so far. No, it was just the water's too high. There's still a bunch of it out there, unfortunately. It comes on a little later in the year, and it's been too cold for most of the flowering rush to come up, so I couldn't find any. But that's yellow flag iris. Get around here, show you the stuffs. It was early enough the year. I found a active blossom. Haven't had that for many, many years. So it is kind of a pretty plant, even though it's a nightmare. This thing, if left unchecked in a spot like Ashenfelter Bay between yellow flag iris and flowering rush, if we have a heavy infestation in there and didn't treat it, the bay wouldn't exist in 10 years. It would just fill that sucker up. The other problem, especially bad with flowering rush, is there is a specific species of snail that likes it, that happens to be the intermediate host for the parasite that causes swimmer itch. So flowering rush, really bad. And if you have a bunch of it in there, you're gonna get swimmer's itch when you're in the water. So yeah, and it doesn't take very long. I was surprised at that. Yeah, we don't have swimmer's itch that much up there, but early on when we first started doing the experimental treatments of it, the folks that were doing the treatment got it. So when you have a heavy infestation of this, and they come up like any other Irish plant, really thick tuft, all the leaves come up, your big seed stems come up, or flowering stems come up in the middle. So it's really hard to miss a yellow flag iris infestation, even if it isn't flowering, because it looks like or not flowering rush, sorry, yellow flag iris, because it looks like an iris plant that you'd have in your garden. The tubers are kind of interesting. I called them sweet potatoes, but when you pull them apart and slice through them, a lot of times they're just bright orange red like a sweet potato. I mean, it's amazing how similar they look, but they are very woody and tough to cut through with your shovel. So that's the tuber. The tubers are long and even kind of sweet potato shaped. They're just not as big around. Most of them are inch and a half in diameter, and 4 to 6 inches long. So that's yellow flag iris.
Would those mix in with like cattails in the same habitat?
They definitely would grow in the same habitat. Most of the ones we see along the river, they're right along the shoreline. They aren't up the bank. Even if it's a flooded area, they still grow right along, so that their roots are wet at normal summer pool. But they can go up a little bit from there. They can't really go down. They can't be submerged all year, or the whole root base can't be submerged all year, I don't believe. It can be submerged through the flood. But yeah, you could, but just from the look, the coloration will be totally different. You can see one growing through the middle of a cattail population, and you'd be able to clearly see that that's a yellow flag iris, because it comes up in a bunch and its color is a little bit different. So
if you had those around a pond, say, and the pond went totally dry for a year or so, would those survive?
Probably take more than a year. Probably take 2 or 3.
2 or 3.
Yeah, just because the tubers retain so much moisture, that would be my guess. But I haven't really done any research on it. But I'm guessing it'd take at least 2 and maybe more years. If you had a really thick, healthy population to begin with, it'd probably get smaller and smaller each year. But it'd probably take a number of years for it to go completely dry.
You're talking